Hey guys, this week is a really interesting conversation we had with Cass Phillipps. She is the global organizer of the FailCon, the Fail conference, which emphasizes learning lessons from startups who have not succeeded. And it's an amazing conference. Kyle and I with FlowTab were invited to speak a couple of years ago. And now it is in over 7 countries and has really taken off. Cass has moved out of the organizer role. She wants to transition the conference into a nonprofit. You can hear her strategy there. So if you're interested, also something to reach out to her or us and we can connect you. And we talked to Cass about her life before startups, before the conference in theater. And what I found really interesting in the conversation was how she compartmentalized the experience of theater requiring an audience the same way startup technology and products require users. And I really agree with her that the biggest mistake startup founders will make is they'll constantly iterate without users and consider it pivots when, their friends, family, and a couple beta users don't work out. And just hearing about all her experiences working with different startups from her background in theater was really an interesting conversation that we don't typically get into on the show, but I found fascinating. So hope you enjoy, and be sure to leave us any comments you have on the bottom, and look forward to it. Thanks again. All right, today is a special show. We have Cass Phillipps on. She is the organizer, I should say, of FailCon. Maybe there's a different title you'd like to use. But again, we have myself, Mike, Brian, Faisal on the show. Cass, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Welcome.
So Cass, tell us about FailCon. Maybe cover the basics in terms of how you started it, what you did before this, how you got to be where you are.
Sure. It's a kind of eclectic story. I actually recently told it on another podcast and found that it's a bit long and a bit eclectic. But I started off, I moved to the Bay Area to do stage management in local theater productions, and just found that I loved the creative process of working so closely with a team to create something for the public. And something that was always changing and very, very kind of moving and flowing with the times. I didn't like kind of the time that theater took, and honestly, the pay that it gave you. As a side gig, I started taking on events with a friend of mine who ran SF Data, Christian Perry, and he was looking for someone to help him kind of just essentially stage manage conferences. That moved on. I started doing events for the Bay Area as a full-time job for about 6 years. And towards the end of that run, I started a startup with some friends that, suffice it to say, looking back, had all the classic first-time mistakes where we didn't even really have a problem. We just had a solution we thought was cool to something that wasn't even an issue with users. We didn't talk to our potential users enough. We didn't make an MVP. We just kept iterating on UI and iterating UI. And if people had deep issues with the product, we would just try to change the UI to answer their questions. So a lot of the classic startup mistakes. And I hear you guys laughing. I'm sure you know kind of those similar feelings. You talk around this issue that what you're doing isn't working, and you do that for 6 months to a year to however long. And what happened while I was doing that, I was still running a couple of events just to keep money coming in. And I was attending these events that I was producing, and this would have been 6 years ago now, and feeling that I couldn't actually tell people what was going on with my startup. It seemed like everybody in the room was doing really, really well at their startups, and that they were excited and positive and felt that their idea was right. And so I always felt like I had to say, no, things are going really well. Like user tests they're really revealing. We just had a great talk with a group of VCs who technically haven't even responded to my emails. Things are they're awesome. They're really awesome, which wasn't helpful for me at all at the time. It's like, that's not what I needed. I really needed speakers to say like, hey, Startup 101, it's really hard. Here are some of the problems you're going to encounter, because you are going to encounter problems. Your first idea is probably going to be a failure. Here's how you move on from it. Here's how you structure those tests. Here's how you respond to that negative feedback. This is just part of the process. But at least 6 years ago, that wasn't very public. We didn't really talk about that failure process that is naturally a part of startups. So FailCon just kind of started as a spinoff of that. My startup was starting to wind down, and I wanted a new project. And I started asking people about starting a conference where speakers had to talk about that process, about their failures on the way to their startup success. And it just received very positive response. So that was the first FailCon was 6 years ago, October. So that's how it kicked off.
Wow. What was the first startup? What were you trying to accomplish there?
We called it Trogger. I still feel like there's something to be said for it, but we were looking, and again, this was 6 years ago, so it was a little dated, maybe 7 at this point with the startup. We were looking at forums and how forums and message boards and how disconnected from social media they felt. Yeah. That you were so anonymous, and if you had a really good reputation in one forum, you couldn't take that reputation with you to another forum and kind of continue that conversation in essentially uniting forums in a more kind of global community, even if it didn't include social media, so you could keep the anonymity, but at least bringing them together so your reputation could travel with you if you went to different message boards or different forums.
I was really ahead of the curve.
I felt like there was a kernel of that was true, as we've now seen so much social media connection. And this was before Facebook Connect. I mean, this was before any of these things were linking people. But I think we didn't understand how forum users like to use forums and the aspects of that walled garden that they enjoy. Yeah. And by not understanding this, we just kept reinventing this solution that didn't really have the right problem around it.
Absolutely. Well, if you started this today, it would be Trogger Lee, right? Yeah. .ly. It's funny because I think companies like Clout are sort of trying to do that indirectly, right? They're trying to create your social currency, and that in some way maybe gives you weighting and people rank and concepts like that is pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. So when you started this, did you realize how the psychological aspect, how this played out, and the cathartic experience that everybody has when you hear, almost like an AA meeting, somebody comes up and starts laying out what their failure is. I mean, I would think a lot of people are afraid to reveal. I mean, guys like Mike are heroic in the sense that they actually came out and said things, in public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was actually something that the very first event, there was a fine line to walk. A lot of people use the example of AA, and I don't want FailCon to be AA. I think AA is very therapeutic psychologically, the community. But I also hear what you're saying, that I don't want it to be too cut and dried. I love trying to create an agenda that allows an attendee to move emotionally through the story. And that's kind of like my theater background. It's like trying to tell the good story, that it feels practical and not like a big love fest, but does have an emotional moment in it.
That's why I feel it's amazing, your background. And I was being a bit funny earlier. As far as we're concerned, we're probably the most optimistic group of people, because in reality, the longer I've been doing this a little too long, but as long as you keep observing this, you realize that there are certain elements of human nature. We are always going to continually try to reinvent the wheel. The sad part is sometimes so much resources could have been used in other ways. And I think getting the message out, like, for example, misunderstanding what problem you're trying to solve. I mean, it seems so easy to us nerds, us technologists. We just throw technology out of it. And it's fascinating to me, somebody with a theater background and probably some literature background and soft science background. You're approaching this, because most technologists will never see it that way. They'll just keep hacking at the wall and saying, "Well, the problem is the wall," and not realize the wall's there for a reason.
Right. I mean, that's a little bit of what I think the Lean Startup movement has been trying to push for. It's the sense of doing more good qualitative and quantitative research ahead of time, and really getting out and talking to your users, and kind of almost pushing to ignore technology a little bit. And like, can you make a paper prototype? Can you make a mailing list that somehow solves this problem, and just test that and see what the response looks like? Because that's going to be so much more valuable. And those are the things that I think people don't call failures, where it's like, if that doesn't work, it's not a failure because it was a day or two. Technically, it is a failure, and it's the stigma we have towards the word that's like, no, that wasn't a failure. It was just a test, and our hypothesis was negative, so we can move on.
Well, it's
a failure, but it's a healthy failure. It's a good
if you look
failure.
at Edison, right? You look at any inventor, and it's been lionized and become a mythos that, I tried 1,000 times and I didn't really fail. I just learned what I shouldn't do.
I learned 1,000 ways not to build a light bulb.
Exactly. But I think, and maybe this is my feeling, and see if you can resonate this. I think sometimes the venture capital community almost creates this environment where there's a heightened expectation of something remarkable that's going to happen. Therefore, they have to go for the big kill, the big decision, the big transformation, something quote unquote disruptive, even though it's not even technically in the world of Clayton Christensen. Whereas, and I'm not saying the VCs want that just for financial reasons. I think it's their psychology is, I invested in something that's going to change the world. I mean, unfortunately, I'm sure you hear that that's the premise of what a lot of people are basing their startup on. We're going to change the world, and how many things really change the world realistically?
Well, from a psychological point of view, I mean, Ken Robinson said that, our education system and society is such that it stigmatizes failure, it penalizes it. It does not allow you to sort of, if you're a failure, you're just something who's an outcast, and that's absolutely wrong. And it starts with the education system,
The idea of me taking a student's paper and essentially saying these are all wrong, you have an F, is mind-blowing, especially like you're talking about with the soft sciences. Math, at least there is a right answer out there. And hopefully in some of our, more private schools where we have smaller classrooms, the F can become an A if you then take the student and you coach them through, here's how you get to the right answer. Let's try to understand what you were confused by. But especially in like the soft sciences, the literature and the writing, why is my writing a paper in a creative and new way an F?
Exactly.
Why isn't it
imagine Shakespeare giving his first assignment into the professor. Imagine what he said.
E. Cummings in his grammar class.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even Einstein in his physics class. I mean, he was told you will never be a scientist, and I think what we're really talking about is not really binary right or wrong. It's trying to ascertain what creativity is. Because the essence of what we're talking about here is creativity. And in my view, and I've worked with a lot of creative people in the music industry, et cetera, there is no failure in creativity. There is potentially a failure in understanding what the marketability is for a creativity. Like if somebody writes an incredible song or does an incredible play, it may be the wrong time. And, there have been, look at Shakespeare. In his era, nobody really understood his works. I mean, they were not popular. We're now just beginning to truly understand the dimensions of what he was trying to do with language. I mean,
what's interesting with creativity and like, can there be a failure in creativity? I think this goes to a core idea I think about with failure. It's like how you define it. Because I disagree a little bit. I think you can have a failure in creativity if you fail to accomplish the goal that you set out to. So in a sense, like if you set out to create Katy Perry's next hit song, and it is not a hit song, it is a failure. As a creative person, was it a failure? No. You probably learned something creatively. As a practical application to what you needed to do, it was a failure. And it's that strange thing of how do you define success for the project you're currently working on?
Exactly.
And that is what the failure will be. And
it is always that
startups to remember too.
That determinism is the problem. Is what is your determinism? I mean, a piece of creative work stands on its own, but if you did it because you wanted to be a platinum selling artist, then absolutely it's a royal failure. But the creativity in and of itself just stands on its own. Creative work coming from anybody I think is beautiful. Unfortunately, it may not be understood by anybody but the artist.
Yeah, being successful or being a failure, that itself is just, a general popular opinion,
Absolutely.
what the consensus says.
Yeah.
And then you have to look at it, is someone failing just because in this frame of time we are looking at it as a failure? It could be very well a success over, a larger frame of time, so to speak.
Yeah, it's something that I think actually ties startups to theater in more ways than one. But the idea of performance and the idea of when you bring a customer or another person in, I think about it a lot with theater, that sometimes people create theater that is personally cathartic, and they're like, I'm going to do this moving, incredible piece that is personally cathartic and important to me. And I actually think that's a failure as a theatrical performance.
Yes.
Because as a theatrical performance, you have an audience who is probably paying money, and they have an expectation. And if you do this weird out there thing that really is only for you, and it's purely for your own catharsis, that is a failure as a theatrical performance. Is it a failure as a creative piece for yourself? No. And that's a similar thing with startups, where the minute you decide to open your product up and ask people to pay for it, you now have another level of expectation that can cause a new type of failure that is a little more public and a little more challenging.
Cass, I'll end cap this. When I used to instruct musicians about their career, and I'm talking incredible musicians, I said the moment that you become the moment you go out and ask somebody to pay money for your performance, it's now a partnership between you and the person listening. And your music is no longer your own. It's now theirs. It's for the ages, et cetera. And you are now a performer. And there's no purity at that point. If you play in your garage alone to your dog and your best friend, then fine. But if somebody's taking their hard-earned cash and giving you money, they are the customer, and they're going to be the rising and falling judgment of the quality of your work. And this is a quagmire of all creative people. Everybody hits a glass ceiling of creativity. Startup founders do that. In fact, it's harder to watch in the startup community when a founder is going on to move from one startup to another, and you just see, and I don't want to mention names, but you just see desperation. You see the VC money coming out, right? There's a tremendous amount of money, but there's this idea that just because you did it one time, you can do it again, as if it's some kind of mechanical process, when it really comes down to luck and creativity and beyond luck, being at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at theater, because I know like a theatrical performer, it is trained in their body that the minute you start working on a piece, you get an audience in front of it. And the first few times you don't ask them to pay, but it's like theater is for an audience. That is what theater is. So there must be an audience presence for it to be theater. So many startups still struggle, even with the lean startup movement. It's not ready to show to users. It's not ready to show to users. Users are what you're building. Without users, you are not building anything. And so despite us saying like having a user come in does make it a more kind of official failure, that's not to say I discourage users from coming in. In fact, quite the opposite. That it's like you won't even know that you failed until you get a user there. You need to start getting those users.
So, Cass, how about you run us through what a typical conference is, because I see that you do conferences all over the world. What does it entail? Just some form of a semblance as to what the expectations are, and what do people walk away with?
And how they get started. I mean, what's the process?
Sure. Yeah. So it is true. I think we're now in about 20 different cities. We've been produced in about 20 different cities around the world. Almost every continent. We're still working on Africa. At their core, they are all very similar in their outward structure. They can look very different. The conferences start because an entrepreneurial group or a group of organizers in an entrepreneurial community in an area will reach out to me just through the website and say, hey, we've seen FailCon. We really like the message. We don't think it's discussed enough in our community, and we'd like to produce one. And this is pretty common, actually. I think the Bay Area is the one area that probably doesn't need FailCon anymore. We're very open to discussing failure, maybe even too open to discussing failure. I often wonder about that. But overseas, there's still a lot of deep cultural roadblocks to having these conversations, and they mean a lot more just socially and historically and traditionally than they can maintain here in the Bay Area, which in the scheme of things is a very young culture.
And Cass, I'm curious, how do you think that, I'm looking at your upcoming locations list, and you have some amazing locations, Dubai, Iran, Tokyo. How do these organizations or these independent entrepreneurial groups find out or acknowledge that this would be something valuable, right? Because I'm sure they could bring in many different conferences with different focuses, and this takes time and attention for them. What is the thing? Do you think a lot of them were participants in other conferences and see the value in it?
Usually they come with some experience having produced conferences before. So they're not always entrepreneurs themselves. They are just kind of leaders in those communities to help bring them together. We do get a fair amount of international press. They often hear about that. They'll watch some of the videos. And I think it's also at its core something that anyone who is remotely entrepreneurial knows is true and is frustrated isn't being discussed. We all know as an entrepreneur and as a creative individual, we are not going to get it right on the first try. And people that do think that will very quickly learn they are wrong. And so these are people who say, this conversation needs to be happening. I don't know how to start it. And so they go off into the web to find other people who have started it. How has this conversation started? And FailCon is just often a solution to that that'll come up with pretty much a clear step-by-step guide of how to get one to kick off. Like we even have a 12-week guide. It's like on week 1, you need to have these things. On week 2, you need to have these things. And we do a follow-up call. On week 3, it's this. On week 4, it's this. To try to really break down that process of how to produce an event, especially if it's your first one.
Is this a not-for-profit event, or is it a for-profit?
It has in the past been a for-profit. I've been talking to more and more people and think I'm going to see, despite the headache it will cause, if I can turn it into a nonprofit. It's actually very, very part-time work for me. It is not something I dedicate a lot of time to, and I am more in love with the idea and the message and the goal of it and the sense of community that it provides than I am having any desire that it needs to make money. So it's a change that I actually would like to make to it. It was work I was doing for profit for a while. I have since moved on to that, and most of the organizers I've now been talking to say, no, I have a job, or I have my own startup and it's VC funded. I'm doing this because I want to drive the community. And I think that becoming a nonprofit, because the philosophy matches so well, will actually help us grow in the right direction.
How about continual support? Like, do you create mastermind groups where people come in and former quote unquote failurees go out and help young startups, even though it's outside the event, sort of a rounding of the community?
Sadly, I haven't actually done a lot outside of the events to help the community continue to grow. I've done a few things and found it just so challenging to artificially create that, like through a Facebook group or a Twitter handle. So what I'll often do is, at least at the events, the last 2 events, I forget what I called the hashtag now, but I started something that's like, what I do tomorrow. And it's just this goal that, what am I going to, like, it's perfectly fun to sit in these conferences, even if they're not on failure, and take notes and feel like, oh, I'm doing something because I'm attending a conference, which is complete bullshit. The conference is an excuse not to do work.
Yeah.
So what's the thing that you're going to take from this conference and change about your business tomorrow?
See, I can see it really taking hold, and just my mind working here is to sort of create at least a very least a manifesto to walk away from the conference and say, this is the distillation of what we've learned from holding all these conferences, and these are the top 10 takeaway things that you need to refer to, like maybe like a 12-step program, but you kind of keep going to them every day, hopefully every week, and saying, okay, am I doing this? Am I doing that? Am I doing this? And then maybe create reach out organizations, maybe for profit, maybe they're consultants, I don't know, that will come in and say, I'm outside the forest and I'm coming in here and you're doing 1 through 10, and maybe this is what you can do. I mean, what you said before, this is not ready for public viewing. If you want to see an exorcist simulation in me, this drives me insane. I mean, my head spins around. I'm like, if you're building anything and you're not ready to show anybody, then you haven't built anything. Right. It's that simple. You just have an idea. And I'm great about talking about ideas, but don't say you're building or you have a product or you're testing unless it's ready for somebody to see.
And so Cass, what was it like growing this conference? So coming out of theater, inspired by this lack of acknowledgement or understanding around failure, you started a couple conferences, and it kind of just sounded like it took legs of its own and carried off into what it is today. And now you spend very, few number of hours a day on it. Like, what is that like to start the conference, have it grow? And then I'd be interested if you're open to discussing what you're working on now. And if there's anything that you're looking for, if it's...
Yeah, and just to add to that, if the template has always been the same since 2009, or are you going to be changing it?
I mean, that's an easy question to answer. It is not. I have found that I am getting, especially in the Bay Area, very tired of talking heads on stage. So we've pushed more and more into roundtable discussions, workshops, small conversations on very specific topics. And it's where a lot of the international shows are going. we still are a similar structure of people on stage having conversations, but many of them this year have started adding also like a workshop hour or two. I think that especially with a conversation like this, it needs to evolve from, in a new city, it's still good to have talking heads. The audience actually doesn't know how to have the conversation yet. They don't understand how to open up, like we've been talking about failure, and how to kind of leave their shame at the door. So they often start off as talking heads or panels. Usually by the second year, you can start having workshops where you invite the attendees to start having that conversation, which is a really important step because the goal of FailCon is all of us sharing our failures, not just founders of giant successful companies, but every single person being able to talk to a VC, a press person, anyone about what failure looks like. So the template is definitely changing. And I usually talk with each individual organizer about kind of what's the status of your community? How do you think they'll get the most out of this? How long should it be? What time of day is it? And we'll adjust that accordingly to what that city needs. On the question, I guess, on how it feels, it's a mixture of feelings because I never set out wanting to be a conference organizer, which is part of why I don't do it now. It was, I guess, the best kind of story in that I saw something that I wanted to fix and knew I could, and so set out to fix it. And then when it felt fixed here in the Bay Area, I was just kind of ready to wind it down. Like, it's good, great. I have a new project. Bay Area is having great conversations. Don't know that we need FailCon anymore. Awesome, problem fixed. And then suddenly internationally, it just, people started hearing about it, and it's just kind of taken off. Like, especially this year, we've been getting so many press requests about it and so many just inquiries on what it is and how it's going. And to me, it never felt like a big thing. It was always just this interesting side project that I thought was a good conversation starter. And really, like you guys said, it took legs of its own. And so it's actually a very mixed feeling. I'm, of course, excited that it's happening, and I love that these conversations are happening. It's interesting because it's at a time that it felt, it's like if you had a big breakup and then 2 years later, right. Want to get back with you. And you're like, wait. I've been there before. Moving on from this. And for me, it actually almost, a piece of me feels like some aspects of FailCon are a failure because I think it could have been greater had I been willing to dedicate time to it. And so when I see it start to take off a little bit, I'm like, man, should I be going back and dedicating more time to this? This
sounds like all great relationships there. So what did you move on to? I mean, if you can share that with us.
Yeah, I'm actually, for the last 2 years, I've been working at a startup called Pocket Gems on game design, and now moving into like mobile and narrative design for them for a new app they have called Episode that I'm completely in love with. It's a really empowering app that has all the tools to let you kind of create an animated choose your own adventure story like The Walking Dead, but you can make it all using our tools in an afternoon. Put it on the app that afternoon and literally send your friends a link to it that afternoon if you wanted to. It is public. We have users. It still has some kind of prototype art in it, but I think it's just an incredible potential. And so I've been working on that. I've been at Pocket Gems the last 2 years and working on Episodes the last year.
Well, are there people that want to take over your carry your torch?
There may be. I haven't actually talked about it with a lot of people.
Well, get with it.
I know it's similar to my international events, and you guys can share this out there. If someone is interested in taking on SF, I am so more than happy to advise them along the way and give them all the materials that we have. It's been a consistently profitable show in SF. You will not be broke doing it. It needs someone who is more active in just the startup community as I used to be, who's kind of willing to push it forward. As it is now, I'm a pretty active advisor on all of the shows going on around the world, but have kind of stepped down from being a full producer myself.
Interesting. Well, I would say this. I don't think it's ever, and going back to the old relationship analogy, I don't think it's ever going to be over. I mean, I think the constant learning environment, because nothing is, nothing ever freezes in time. The startup world is radically different 2 years later. I mean, look at what startups look like today versus in 2010, or even, if you want to go back to 2008, it was a radically different environment.
Yep.
And I think the Moore's law of startups is probably going to accelerate faster. I think every 6 to 9 months, we're going to see a different world out there. And so it's actually going to expand the necessity for something like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I've experienced it firsthand when we started a company called FlowTab. It was a mobile ordering and payment system for bars and nightclubs and hotels, and we worked on it for about a year and almost 2 years. And the things that we went through, you kind of go through these massive milestones in companies, partnerships and launches and customer numbers and things like this. And you eventually step back and you realize there is so much that we've accomplished. So what we did is we published this timeline.
It's so great. Anyone listening should see it.
It was absolutely amazing.
There's the response we got. It was hundreds and hundreds of comments on the TechCrunch article, and we've gotten probably close to 100 inbound requests from people all over the world. And it made me really resonate with your mission to realize like just this little Petri dish sample that we did with our 3-4 man team it was like a tsunami of response. And
can you imagine the world if everybody did that, right?
Sure.
Everybody just externalized what happened.
Yeah, there's an interesting risk to it though, because I'm finding that with these articles, and I bet you guys have seen this too, people like to reply to you as if they fully understand failure. But I am learning more and more that with FailCon, a lot of these people will take these lessons and they will go and they will still reinvent the wheel and make those same mistakes. And sometimes I get frustrated where you're going to get those emails from people that are like, man, this was amazing. It changed my life. It really helped me rethink about how my startup is structured. And maybe a third of them that actually happens. They actually read your thing and actually restructured what they had. But so many of them are going to read it and be like, man, that was deep. All right, time for work.
I think it's how set. I think it's how set people are. Like if they're exploring it, we'll get a lot of requests in like stage one. I have this idea. I'm thinking about quitting my job or something, and then I'll basically say, look, like with your current model, I just don't think it's possible, right? And some of them won't, but some of them really will. It'll always make an impact. I think that's the important thing is they'll always have it in their mind. So if they're like, they're going to double down and make some massive bet, or they're just not, I think that's where like the weight of just the correctional course, like be the compass, don't guide the ship, but be a strong suggestion as the way you're going.
Yeah. And that might be really part of our conversation on failure is opening up the deeper idea of just honesty. Like if failure were more accepted, I think more of us would be willing to tell someone their product might be a failure. But as it is, so often your friends are like, oh yeah, it's cool. I totally use it. Like I think you guys talked about this in your post where your friends are all like, yeah, this is great. It's totally great. It's super great. Because no one wants to tell you, dude, your idea is dumb. I'm not understanding what its applications are for my life. I don't think I would actually use it.
I think we do that on the show all the time.
First thing I tell anybody is nobody's baby is ugly. Every baby is beautiful, and this is your baby, and that's great. But you don't want to take your product to your friends because actually they're giving you such a false positive that you may never get back from that journey they put you on. You want to take. True. In fact, most of the products that I see fail miserably, they're the ones that their friends say, "This is so cool, man. You got to do this." And
I heard a great tip for your listeners was. Take your product out literally into the streets, show it to people, and ask them at that moment to pay you $1 for it. Because even strangers are super friendly, especially to other strangers. They're like, I don't know who you are. I don't want to hurt your feelings. Sure, it's great. Literally say, I'm going to give this to you if you give me $1 for it right now. Or find a way to do something
love that.
Like that with your product.
Oh my God.
It's really cheap. It's not a big investment.
That's a great tip. That's a great tip.
That's what I make musicians do. Every musician I ever knew, I said, you need to go out right now, record a CD, and try to sell it. Get headphones, let people listen. If
you become a great salesperson, that's for sure.
But you need to be. Everybody needs to be a salesperson. Yeah.
Cass, we really enjoyed having you on today. It was awesome.
Yeah,
absolutely. It was a lot of fun.
Cool.
Wish we had 4 hours. You were.
I know. I'm sure we could fill it up.
I know. I don't think we touched on half the things we talked about touching on, so it was great.
Cool.
Follow-up.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Thanks again, Cass.
Take care. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.